Okay, the last lecture, the last thing I talked about was adaptations or adapting to the environment. Adaptations are characteristics that allow an organisms to be better fit for their environment. For example, as primates, we have opposable thumbs. But organisms can adapt to their environments in different ways. Different things can happen over time which can lead to new species, and divergent evolution is one of them. Divergent evolution is the process of two or more related species becoming less and less alike because they're adapting to different environments. If something diverges, that means they go apart, they move apart. So these are organisms that were one time related, were of the same species, but now they are of different species. Continental drift is how this can happen, is only one of the many ways this can happen. My example is the red fox and kit fox. At one time, the red fox and kit fox were of the same species. They lived in the same environment, so they needed genes to survive in that environment. But over time, due to migration, these fox moved. The kit fox live in southwest United States, where you need to have browner fur than the red fox. The red fox live here in Iowa, and their reddish fur allow them to blend into their environment and stay alive. So as these fox migrated, and if they migrated to the southwest, if they had brown fur, which means they have to have a gene that allows them to have the browner fur, they were able to survive, pass on that brown fur gene. The ones who had maybe reddish tint fur were dying off because they couldn't blend into their environment, just like with that peppered moth activity. So the genes for red fur were disappearing in the southwest United States. But in Iowa, in the Midwest, having the gene for red fur has allowed them to survive. So now they are considered two different species. They cannot reproduce and have fit offspring. So that was divergent evolution. They moved away from each other and now are of two different species. Convergent evolution are unrelated species that look alike. You would think that they are related. But the reason they look alike is because they're living in the same type of environment. They are not related closely. Dolphins and sharks. Dolphins and sharks are both animals, so they're slightly related, but yet dolphins are mammals and sharks are chondrichthyes. So they're not very closely related at all, even though some people would say they are, but they're not. The reason that they have characteristics that are the same is because they're both living in the ocean. They both have to be able to live in salt water. They both have to have the fins to help them move through the water and have their streamlined shape, all of which allows them to survive in that same type of environment. So that's known as convergent evolution, because they kind of look the same. Converging means coming together. And these two animals cannot reproduce. They are of two different species. Another way organisms adapt to their environment is known as coevolution. And as you know, co means both. So both animals evolving together. Predators and prey usually co-evolve. For example, the lynx and rabbits co-evolve. As the rabbit population increases, so will the lynx population, because the lynx have plenty of food to eat. If the rabbit population declines, so will the lynx population, because they don't have enough food. The other example I have are bees and plants. Bees pollinate certain species of plants. And by pollinating the plant, the bees get food, and the plants are able to make babies. So if there is a plant species that goes extinct, the bees that pollinate them, the bees won't have food anymore, so those bees will die off. Or if there is a bee species that goes extinct, the plants now will not be able to get their pollen to the egg, so they can't make babies. So that plant species will go extinct. So bees and plants co-evolve. They help each other out. Okay. This whole time we've been talking about organisms and how they're related to each other. And we had mentioned that scientists determine how closely related they are by using DNA. And there's a few other ways they have done this over time before they were able to do DNA testing. And we need to know some vocabulary here. So we have gene pool. It's a collection of genes for all of the traits within a population. So for example, if we have humans, our gene pool is all of our genes needed for survival. Allele frequency is the percentage of a specific allele in the gene pool. So the percentage of blue eyes in the human population, the percentage of brown eyes in the human population. Or if you're talking the peppered moths, the percentage of black moths living in the environment versus the percentage of white moths surviving. Genetic equilibrium are genes that are equal, or genes staying the same. A population that is in genetic equilibrium, those allele frequencies will not change from generation to generation. With that bead activity, you had the black rabbits and the white rabbits. And the part of the activity that you did from generation 1, 2, and 3, those rabbits were definitely not in genetic equilibrium because the percentages of the black versus white allele were changing over time. The part of that activity that we did together as a class, that was showing you genetic equilibrium. From generation to generation to generation, the gene numbers were staying the same. The frequency was staying the same. 25, 50, 25. We had a little bit of a change, but not a dramatic change. So part of the activity that we did together showed genetic equilibrium. The part that you guys did together in groups was showing a population not in genetic equilibrium. Okay, determining if organisms are related. Then they're going to look at some common characteristics, and there's many types of characteristics that they can look at. They can look at a homologous characteristic. And a homologous characteristic is a structure that are derived from the same structure in the embryo. So for example, the arm of an alligator and the arm of the penguin, that's a common characteristic. It's a homologous characteristic. It derived from the same part in the embryo, which means it derived from the same DNA. So alligators and penguins have to somehow be related. Vestigial organs. It's a functionalist part of one animal that actually functions in another. An example of that is our tailbones. Our tailbones don't really have a function, but in primates it helps form a tail, which they use for balance and getting through the trees. So the fact that we have a tailbone says that we had to have some DNA the same. Another vestigial organ is our appendix. We had to have DNA that made that appendix, but our appendix doesn't function in us, but it does function in some other animals. So again, common characteristic, a characteristic that's the same due to some similar DNA. Biochemistry, the chemical makeup between two species is similar. Then they could be somehow related. So the metabolism of vastly different organisms is based on the same biochemical compounds. So how we metabolize food and how all other animals metabolize food is very similar. So our biochemistry is the same, and the chemicals we produce is because of the DNA we have. Embryological development. What scientists will do is look how the embryos develop over time. And you will see at the early stages of embryos, a lot of organisms look very, very similar. So then our DNA must be the same if we start out looking the same. And I can show you pictures of that if you ask me for that. And I can show you us compared to other animals, and we look very, very similar to other organisms when we are embryos. Harding-Weinberg principle. This has come about with lots of studies over how animals have changed over time. A population will remain in genetic equilibrium if and only if the following 5 things take place. The following 5 things have to take place in order for organisms to stay the same from generation to generation to generation. If any one of these 5 is happening, then the population is not in genetic equilibrium and allele frequencies will be changing. So in order for things to stay the same, in order for genes to stay the same, you can't have any mutations. Because you should know a mutation changes genes, which change chromosomes, which can affect a trait. So we could have a new trait, or maybe a trait disappearing. And if that's happening, you're going to have an allele frequency change over time. So like with the rabbits, a mutation caused the white rabbits to die off. So there was a change over time. Okay, so in order for genetic equilibrium to take place, we cannot have any mutations. In order to keep genetic equilibrium in place, in order for there not to be a change, individuals do not migrate. Migration is the movement of individuals into or out of a population. This will bring about gene flow, or movement of genes in or out of the population, which can then alter frequencies. If you had a whole bunch of white rabbits that were able to survive and a black rabbit moved in, now you're going to start producing black babies, and you'll still have some white babies, but over time, from generation to generation, those allele frequencies will change, which means you're not in genetic equilibrium. So in order for things to stay the same from generation to generation, individuals do not migrate. In order for things to stay the same, the population has to be very large. For example, the raccoon population, there's lots and lots of raccoons, so there's a good chance that they're going to be in genetic equilibrium, unless there's mutations or migrations, which is possible. In order for things to stay the same, individuals have to mate randomly, meaning animals at a zoo, that's not mating randomly. They have to be able to go out and choose their mates as they want to. In order for things to stay the same, natural selection cannot occur. If natural selection is taking place, allele frequencies are changing over time. While mutations, migrations, genetic drift can change the gene pool, those things can change genes over time, or at least allele frequencies. Those things usually will not cause significant changes that will actually lead to a new species. But natural selection can lead to significant changes, and then over hundreds of years, you could actually have a new species. I mentioned genetic drift. If you don't know what that is, that's just allele frequencies in a population change as a result of a random events or a random change. Usually people call genetic drift Mother Nature, like an earthquake. If an earthquake suddenly happened and killed off a whole bunch of organisms, well, now the allele frequencies are going to change. So genetic drift is Mother Nature acting on organisms.